you very much for coming. We were expecting a few more people, but several tried off today. But thank you for attending. We're filming this event because most of our members are outside and living abroad. And increasingly, it's becoming international, as the name suggests. So this is why we're filming it. This will be available on our YouTube channel a little later. But I'm delighted that we have Professor Hugh Kennedy to talk to us today. I don't think he needs much of an introduction. He's a professor of Arabic at SOAS. I was previously professor of medieval history.
Well, Middle Eastern history, I was in the end.
Middle Eastern history at Aberdeen. St Andrews.
St Andrews, yes.
And his PhD is from Pembroke College. He's also a fellow of the British Academy. He was the author of numerous books, including The Prophet of the Age of the Caliphates and Caliphate, the History of an Idea. This lecture is named in the honour of Beatrice Cardi, who was one of our previous presidents, and was a distinguished archaeologist. This lecture, we've always wanted it to be an in-person event, which is why we're trying to do it in this age of Zoom as an in-person event. So this is the first one we've done for 2 years. We had originally planned to do this in 2020.
Yes, it's been postponed and postponed.
Yeah, 2 years ago.
By COVID.
So it's taken a long time to do. And there'll be, if you have time after, there'll be a few minutes. But,
Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's very nice to be here. It's very nice of you to come to this sort of, as it were, drafty church hall here on a Monday evening. I know this church hall quite well because I'm a member of the congregation here and on the parish church council and so on. So it's partly my sort of linking up that has led to us coming here. So I hope you enjoy it, and I hope it works well as a place to get together and a venue and so on. I'm going to pass around a book which this is not a sales thing, it's not actually going to be published until December. But this is my new translation of Baladhuri's Futuh al-Buldan, which I'll be the subject of this talk, or at least part of which is, and which has, I first got the copy about a week ago, so it's very new. It will. It's the longest book I've ever written. It comes in about 600 pages. but of course it is a translation. It's not all out of my own imagination and so on. And what I thought when Noel contacted me and said, would you like to do something? I thought what I'd talk about is the way Baladhuri uses or he accounts for the Muslim conquest of Arabia, what he thinks is interesting and what he thinks isn't. Now, there are a couple of reasons why I think this is quite important, and this book is a subject worth dealing with. One of them is Baladhuri's own work. Baladhuri, who died in 892, but probably the Common Era, but probably wrote this book in 865, 866, i.e. 30 years or so before he died. And I can tell that from internal evidence of the things he discusses and particularly things he doesn't discuss, lead me to assume that. As far as I can tell, and I've done a bit of research on this, what the text that we have, published first by that great Dutch Orientalist Miguel de Goya in 1866, the text as we have it now is very close to what Baladhuri wrote. And we know this partly from the manuscript tradition, and we know it partly from other witnesses, i.e. people who copied bits of it, acknowledged copied bits of it, very soon after the date that I think it was written. And this by itself is interesting because there's a lot of debate with early Islamic sources, early Arabic sources. You know, what exactly are they? Are they actually what the person whose name is on the cover actually wrote, or are they later confections that have been re-edited and so on and so forth? And I think with Baladhuri's Futuh al-Buldan, then we can get quite close to saying this is what this is what the author wrote at the time when we think he wrote it. And that's quite interesting and comforting. But also interesting because Baladhuri lived in the last generation when you could talk about a united caliphate. Shortly, well before his death, with the death of the murder of the Caliph al-Mutawakkil in 861, the Abbasid Caliphate began to disintegrate. And as we know, and many Muslims have commented on to their sadness ever since, the Muslim Ummah has never come together again. So he represents the last generation for whom a united Ummah, it wasn't quite, of course, because Muslim Spain and Portugal, Al-Andalus had hived off, as it were, before then, but generally. And so what we're seeing is how a man at the centre of affairs, and we know that Baladhuri was, because we have accounts of him in the presence of the Caliph, which of course, being in the presence of the Caliph at one of these nighttime literary and drinking evenings that Caliph al-Mutawakkil was so famous for, being actually in there in close proximity to the Caliph himself was quite rare, and not everyone got to do that. And so he's at a particular moment, he comes to the heart of it. And he wrote this book, I think, a whole lot of reasons I'll try and talk about. But his book, it's called Futuh al-Buldan, The Conquests of the Countries in Arabic. But that's not as easy as it sounds. Superficially, and most people have regarded this, this is an account of the great Arab conquest. It's an account of how the Arab Muslim armies came out of Arabia and conquered all the areas that we know that they conquered, all the way from Al-Andalus and the Maghreb, right through to Central Asia and Sind. And it forms, it's a sort of geographical narrative. He starts off in Arabia, which is where we'll be this evening, and he goes on to Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Then he refocuses and goes to Iraq and the conquests in the Caucasus, the conquests in Khorasan, that great province, northeastern province of Iran, which in fact stretches way beyond modern Iran, and finally to Sind in Pakistan. So it is superficially, if you like, an account, what literary critics have talked about these things like to call a Heilsgeschichte. That's a holy war saga, basically, of how wonderful the Muslims were and how God, because they were so wonderful and because God was so wonderful himself, how God gifted them these conquests and so on. And so people have largely treated it. And it has a particular presence in the Western European scholarship, in that it was the first of the great Arab chronicles of the conquest to be translated into English. And that established its, it was the to-go-to place, particularly if people who were writing about history of the Middle East and didn't read any Arabic. But even for those who did, the Futuh translation of 1916 was where you went to start off. And that's how I came in contact with this text more than 50 years ago when I was a student. I wanted something to read in English, an original source about the Arab conquest to read in English. And so I went to Baladhuri's Futuh. And I struggled, because it's not the sort of text you think it's going to be. I'll just do a few general things before I get on to the Arabian conquest. You think it's going to be heroic stories of great Muslim victories and so on and so forth. But in fact, Baladhuri really isn't interested in fighting at all. I don't think he'd any more seen a battle than most people in this room had seen a battle. He'd heard about them and he knew, the stock phrases, there was fierce fighting and in the end the Muslim prevailed, and the stock cliches and so on. But he really hasn't, he hasn't a clue. And he's not terribly interested in that sort of thing. He's interested in all sorts of other things, which include Quranic tafsir, the commentaries on the Quran. It includes Arab genealogies. He's fascinated by ancient genealogies. He didn't come from an ancient Arab tribe himself. He seems to have been a typical sort of third-generation Persian bureaucrat. But he was fascinated by place names, etymology, and so on. He was fascinated by taxation, and he's a major source. It's something I'm working on quite a lot at the moment. He's a major source for how the fiscal structure of the early caliphate worked, and so on. He's interested in picturesque stories, stories which are funny and absurd. He likes to liven up his narrative with stories and bizarre poems. He has, in lots of ways, his poetry, and there's this cliche that when we're looking at early Arabic sources and so on, we should read the poetry because the poetry is the real message and so on. Baladhuri's poetry is not like that at all. He has all sorts of, he seems to use them as odd, slight sort of, as it were, relief from the main narrative, like you might use illustrations in a modern book and so on, to lighten the context, to give you something else to think about. There's a wonderful series, and coming to Arabia now, of poems about the wells in Mecca. They're quite short poems, no more than 4 lines long, and they are about the wells that were in Mecca really before the time of Prophet Muhammad, or in the early time of the mission of Prophet Muhammad. And in these poems, the poets, who are mostly, but not entirely women, boast about their wells, how their wells are better than anybody else's wells, how other people's wells were filthy and horrible and their wells were pure, and so on and so forth. I think these poems are very archaic. I think they genuinely date from the time of Prophet Muhammad's mission and so on. But they've got nothing to do with the conquest of, the Muslim conquest of the Middle East. They're all about tiny wells in Mecca. And I think it's this sort of varied collection of obscure anecdotes and ridiculous poems and so on that was part of what he's trying to do. And the most curious and perhaps the most extraordinary thing about it is that he devotes more time and energy to disputes amongst the Muslims than he does to Muslim conquests of the Byzantine Empire, the Sasanian Empire, North Africa, and all these things. And so it rather goes against the grain of a triumphant narrative of wonderful Muslims and horrible, stupid non-Muslims and so on. Because the villains of the great set pieces are themselves Muslims. There's a wonderful piece of poetry he has after the conquest of Iraq, in which he denounces, or he quotes a poem, an anonymous poem, which denounces the greed and unscrupulousness of the new Muslim elite, in round terms, and condemning all these people who'd taken over the lands of Iraq and so on and so forth, and were behaving in a disgraceful and greedy and corrupt fashion. So it's a very varied and interesting book. But the first fifth of it, I think almost the first quarter, is about the conquest of Arabia. The book opens without any introduction or beyond a simple Bismillah. There's no introduction to what he's going to talk about. It opens with Prophet Muhammad riding into Medina at the end of the Hijrah. He doesn't have anything to say about Prophet Muhammad in the Meccan period of his life. And that's when, as far as he's concerned, that's when the conquests or the Futuh begin. And so he rides along, and immediately there is a controversy that he focuses in on. And the controversy is about a passage in Quran where Quran talks about a mosque that is founded in error and a mosque that is founded by the pious or founded in piety. So Baladhuri seizes on this and he tries to work out which mosques are being talked about. What is this? I mean, exegetes are worried about this passage like forever. Nobody's come to a sort of serious conclusion. But what are the different references and so on? So immediately we see that Baladhuri is showing off. A lot of the book is, and I don't mean this in a particularly critical way, but a lot of the time the whole spirit of the book is, look how clever I am. I can do this. And so, look how clever I am comes in the first pages. I can do Quranic tafsir. I can do exegesis of difficult bits of Quran. And he does it in this first chapter, and he never does it again. There's no, he doesn't follow on this in any other parts of the narrative at all. So then he talks about, and he goes on to talk about conquest, and he's interested in the conquest of Arabia. And what he's interested in is not the Muslim conquest. The great Muslim battles that all the other narratives concentrate on, Badr, Uhud, those battles where the Prophet Muhammad and the Medinans defeated the Meccans and so on, which is standard seerah stuff, standard biography of the Prophet stuff. He's not interested in that sort of thing at all. The Battle of Badr doesn't come at all. The Battle of Uhud is only referred to because the graves of the martyrs of Uhud are the start of an irrigation channel that he's particularly interested in talking about because the taxation of the irrigation channel is of interest. He's not interested in these great heroic things, but he's interested in conquest and occupation. And he starts off basically with the move to the north and the way in which the Muslims conquered the Muslims in Medina. This is before Mecca had been conquered, in fact, went to various oases on the road to Syria. It starts very early, particularly the still existing town of Khaybar and the now non-existing village town of Fadak, which I'll come back to in a minute, but right up to Aqaba and so on. And he recounts these, and he's absolutely interested in these because they show how Prophet Muhammad decided that the conquered lands should be administered. And in Khaybar, which is the first place of any consequence that the Muslims conquered, Prophet Muhammad decided, according to Baladhuri, that the people of Khaybar, the cultivators of Khaybar, who are mostly Jewish, although there's ones we hear about, would be allowed to keep their lands and cultivate their palm trees because there weren't enough Muslims, and the Muslims weren't particularly interested in that anyway, but they were allowed to keep their lands and so on as long as they paid taxation. And what Baladhuri is interested here is the showing what Prophet Muhammad decided, because this is the basis on which the legal structure of taxation really was developed ever since. As a historian, he's interested in showing what Prophet Muhammad did, and that runs through the ideas of the conquest of Arabia. And then the conquest of Fadak gives him another illustration. Fadak is a no longer existing place, but if you drive north of Isfahan on the motorway to Tehran, you will see a big blue sign saying Baghi Fadak, the Garden of Fadak. Off to the left, it's a place where you can go and have picnics and do all those things that Iranians love so much. And so it's a bit strange, isn't it? But there's a message here. With Fadak was a small village which was gifted or not, or perhaps by Prophet Muhammad to his family, to his biological descendants. Or at least they claimed that it was. Other people said it was public land because it belonged to Prophet Muhammad, and so on and so on. But what he's interested in this is not the capture of Fadak, which, as I say, was just a sort of bucket and spade village on the, going north from Medina. But what he's interested in, because if it belonged to the family of the Prophet, why then the family of the Prophet were the true heirs of Muhammad. And that is super important for Shi'i history and the whole Shi'i origin myth. And that's why the Iranians want to commemorate Baghi Fadak as a stopping off point on a motorway. And it's very interesting, I think, how these little elements in the early Islamic narrative have a resonance that goes right down to the present day in this way. So he talks about going to the north and to the villages. And then he talks about how Prophet Muhammad went south in the Hijaz. And in two places he concentrates on. One is the city of Ta'if, which still exists quite near to to Mecca. Alas, I've never been to the Hijaz. Hijaz exists only in my imagination, as far as I'm concerned. But he goes to the city of Taif, higher up in the mountains, where there is fertile agriculture and so on. This is after the conquest of Mecca, which I could talk about, but I won't know. And why he's interested in Taif? He's interested in Taif for two reasons. Firstly, it shows Prophet Muhammad as a military commander. Prophet Muhammad as commanding the siege of the city of Taif. There's not a lot of detail, but it shows him deploying siege engines and things like that, which is not normally part of the Prophet's image or whatever. And the other thing is Taif is higher than Mecca. There's a certain amount of rainfall. So all sorts of things could be taxed. Apricots, fruit trees, cucumbers, you name it. What do you do? What was the Prophet Muhammad saying about the taxation of cucumbers and so on? And this feeds into a debate about the fiscal structure of the Islamic State in later times, and so it's extremely interesting to him. And of course, in the way of things, nobody really knows the answer. Some people say one thing, some people say the other, and so you know how Muslim law works in the sense of presenting you with a whole lot of contradictions and leaving them on your plate to make up your own mind. And if you're interested in this, there's a book that I just read by a man called Thomas Bauer called Islam, A Culture of Ambiguity, I think. That's the exact phrasing of it. It's published in English about 2 or 3 years ago, and it's very interesting, I think, on pointing out how the Muslim tradition is very seldom very clear, doesn't give you clear answers. It gives you a number of answers, and it's up to you to decide which answer works for you. And that applies to Islamic law as much as it applies to Islamic narratives. But I won't go on about Bauer's book, but it's something that made a big impression on me. So, okay, we go to Taif, and that's conquered. And the other place he's interested in is Najran. Najran, still existing town, just on the Saudi side of the Saudi-Yemeni border. Now Najran, he's interested in because Najran had a well-established Christian community in the time of Prophet Muhammad. And there was worked out a treaty between the representatives of the Prophet. He himself never went down there. But the representatives of the Prophet Muhammad and the Christians of Najran, which is the most detailed working out with about 15 clauses about what the Christians were obliged to do and what protections the Christians got for their status and so on. Like not having their churches taken away, not having, you know, and all these things. So he's interested in that. He's interested in the way the Treaty of Najran plays out in the next 2 centuries, because there is a widespread tradition ascribed to the Caliph Omar, which you may all know, there can't be 2 religions in Arabia. So Christians and Jews had to leave. And the Najran is left as a group, and they went up to Iraq, and he recounts the struggles and so on they had up there. So there again, he's looking at an interesting, Najran is the Christians, Taif is about taxation of cucumbers and so on. Each individual conquest he seizes upon has a message that is to do with the later administration. And then he circles round Arabia, and he circles round Arabia to Oman. Well, he mentions Yemen, but he's very disappointing on Yemen. He just says there was a certain number of battles and they made a treaty and blah, blah, blah. But the early Islamic history of Yemen is a very obscure subject. The sources are very inadequate, and the archaeology doesn't amount to much either. So we really wish he'd said a bit more about who the people were and how he met. And then he goes on to Oman, and he doesn't say much about Oman either. But then he gets to the Gulf Coast, and the Gulf Coast is interesting to him, partly because the resistance to the Muslims was extremely fierce there. The Gulf Coast was really 2 areas. There's what the early Islamic tradition calls, or early Muslims call Bahrain, which is not just the island of Bahrain, but the mainland opposite. And in fact, we hear nothing about the island of Bahrain, which was then known as Uwail. During these narratives, when he talks about Bahrain, he means Eastern Arabia, Hassan, and all those areas there. And then he goes to Yamama. Now, Bahrain is interesting to him because partly there are all sorts of fierce battles there, but which he mentions, and in fact, one of the battles in Bahrain, I think it is, contains the longest list of early Muslim martyrs that he has in the whole of his book. Doesn't talk about the martyrs of Badr or the martyrs of Uhud or anything like that. He talks about the martyrs in Bahrain, where the Prophet Muhammad wasn't. But he lists all these guys who are slain, and indeed I think 2 or 3 women as well. And it gives him an opportunity to show his mastery of genealogy, how he knew how all these people were related and who was cousins to who and which branch of the tribe of Aus or Khazraj or Quraysh they belonged to. So, and the other interesting thing that he's talking about in Arabia, in Bahrain, is the question of Zoroastrians. Because Bahrain was the only place that a population of Zoroastrians, Magians, if you like, Persian Zoroastrians, were conquered in the time of Prophet Muhammad. And so how the Magians of Bahrain were treated was of key importance in that debate that happens when the whole of Iran is conquered. And are the Zoroastrians people of the book? Do they have a scripture? So will they get the sort of semi-privileged status that Christians and Jews had? Or were they simply kuffar, simply unbelievers, whose religion had no value, and therefore whose possessions and properties and so on were fit to be taken by the conqueror? And Baladhuri argues and attempts to show quite clearly that the Prophet Muhammad himself said that the Magians should be treated as people of the book. And this is obviously, we don't know whether it's true or not, but it obviously plays into a much bigger discussion in the Muslim world. Who are people of the book? Who are entitled to be dhimmis? Who are entitled to maintain their churches and their temples and so on? And who were not? And so, because Prophet Muhammad, according to Baladhuri, agreed to this, why then that's a settled matter. The Prophet had agreed to that. So you see quite a little detail about Yamama, like Bahrain, actually leads on to a much bigger debate. And interestingly, when the Muslims conquered Sindh, in southern Pakistan, there was the question of what was the status of the Buddhists in Sindh, because there are lots of Buddhist temples there in those days and so on, and Hindu temples and so on. What was the status of these people? And the Muslims extrapolated from the way that the Magians, Zoroastrians, had become people of the book to argue that Buddhists and Hindus could be people of the book as well. So what appears to be a sort of little footnote of history actually feeds into a much wider argument about how things, about the future of the Islamic State. And that's what Baladhuri is trying to do in this book. He's not just a story of conquest, it's a story of how ideas from that time affect the way the Muslims behave. And then, if you're following your map, he goes back to Central Arabia to Yamama. And Yamama was a particularly hard nut for the Muslims to crack, because it was the center of the anti-Muhammad prophet, who is known as Musaylama, and who the Muslim sources refer to as al-Kazab, the liar. And he and his great tribe, the Banu Hanifa in Yamama, tried to, or Musaylama is said to have proposed to Prophet Muhammad that they should carve up, basically. You be the prophet of Hijaz and Quraysh and so on in the west. I'll be the prophet of Yamama in the east. And Prophet Muhammad is said to have had nothing to do with this and so on. So it was a fight to the death. And Baladhuri recounts the massacres and struggles that went along with that. So Arabia was conquered, at least superficially, and the narrative then halts. But there's, the narrative then halts, and then comes the Ridda, the apostasy, when after the death of Prophet Muhammad, a lot of the areas that had been conquered and so on, if you like, apostatized, they ceased to be Muslims and so on, they went their own way, and it's clear that a lot of the people who pledged their allegiance to Prophet Muhammad in his lifetime felt that when he died, that their allegiance had disappeared. So Baladhuri recounts the campaigns of the Ridda. What happened is absolutely clear that the ruling elite of the Muslims, the ruling group of mostly people from Mecca, established in Medina, the leading members of this were determined to suppress the Ridda by force and by violence, if necessary. The original, in the time of Prophet Muhammad, a lot of the conquests, in inverted commas, had been essentially peace agreements. It had been done by diplomacy and negotiation and so on. With the Ridda, we get, as it were, the iron fist of Muslim conquest. And the Ridda, the people who rebelled against, or the people who incurred the wrath of the Muslims, were nomads, Bedouin in Central Arabia, the people of the Yemen, and the people of the Hadramaut. So each of these tells a different sort of story. The story of the suppression of the tribes in Central Arabia, that is to say between the Hijaz and Yamama really, is one of tribal warfare and brutality. There's interesting discussions about things that have resonances today in this account as well. That's the question of burning of prisoners alive. This horrible practice was not, as far as we can see, have anything to do with, as it were, pre-Islamic tribal warfare. But it's clear that the Caliph Abu Bakr seems to have pushed this and insisted on it, or insisted that it could be done, and there are a few examples. But Baladhuri's account also makes that a lot of Muslims were extremely uneasy about that. Probably the second Caliph Umar amongst them. And he uses this as a discussion of whether it should be allowed or not, and comes down, and the whole weight of the narrative comes down and says this was basically a bad thing to do. But it's interesting, like all these things, so many of these things, it has references to the present day. You remember when the forces of Daesh captured that Jordanian pilot and burnt him alive in a cage? Now, I thought, when I read about that this was a wholly un-Islamic practice. There was no reference in the Seerah of Prophet Muhammad or anything like that to doing that. And then I came across this bit in Baladhuri, and I'm sure the Daesh people, because they use history in that sort of way, would have pointed to the fact that Abu Bakr did it, therefore we are justified in doing it. So these historical details have a peculiar power in later generations to be resurrected and used for better, or in this case for worse. Then there was the reconquest of Yemen. Yemen had a prophet who was called Rahman al-Yaman. He had another name, Ansi al-Aswad. But this is treated basically as a farce. The prophet, so-called in Yemen, is treated as a figure of ridiculous fun. He claims that he can talk to a donkey, and when he says the donkey kneels, then he kneels, and so on, and that he's done to death in the end because his wife, who hates him, betrays him, and so on and so forth. It's treated as almost in a jokey way and certainly the Rahman al-Yemen, the prophet of the Yemen is treated as a ridicule and pass. Again, it doesn't tell us very much about the Yemen. That's the real sad thing. I wish he'd found more details about, where the tribes lived and where the main towns were and things like that. And then he goes on to the last bit of the Ridda, the final campaign. And that's one of the most interesting and colourful figures in early Islamic history at the time of Prophet Muhammad. This is Ash'ath ibn Qais al-Kindi, the chief or the king of the great southern tribe of Kinda in the Wadi Hadramaut and surrounding areas. And he resists the Muslims, and he and his tribesmen, and there's a lot of who's going to get what camels and things like that, good sort of Bedouin stuff. But the fate of Ash'ath ibn Qais al-Kindi is very different from the other rebels. In the end, he marries one of Abu Bakr's daughters. He gives a great feast in Medina. More camels than you can imagine are slaughtered to celebrate his marriage. And he's integrated, he and his family are integrated into the Arab Muslim elite, very important in the conquest of Iraq. His son is one of the great Iraqi rebels against the Umayyads. And his great, however many times it is, was probably known to Baladhuri, because he was that Kindi who is known as the philosopher of the Arabs, that great mid-9th century intellectual who did more than anybody else to move Greek learning and Greek philosophy into Arabic and so on. And I somehow wonder, thinking about Baladhuri, that why he's so interested in Ash'ath ibn Qais al-Kindi is because he actually knew the Kindi in Baghdad, and he doesn't actually explain it, but that's why he's so interested. So there are all sorts of things going on in this direction. So what does Baladhuri's account of the conquest of Arabia tell us about Arabia? Well, not as much as we'd like in all sorts of ways, but it does give us an insight into the different populations that there were. And the contrast between the Bedouin and the people of towns like Khaybar and Najran and so on. The contrast between the people of the Gulf, the shores of the Gulf in Bahrain, and the people of Yamama as well, and the people of the Hijaz. It tells us a lot about Islamic law, things like property, Baladhuri explains how the Prophet Muhammad developed ideas of private property. I won't go into that at the moment, and so on. So there's no other source that gives us this, as it were, snapshot of Arabia, or this tour d'horizon, perhaps we should say, of Arabia during this period, and that covers everything from Oman to Aqaba. In the accounts. It's not everything we would like to know, but it's interesting and lively and a bit bizarre, and it raises all sorts of issues. And that is why I spent the last 5 years being so fascinated by this text and struggling to render it into English. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very happy to have questions and discussion.
Do you have a feeling which areas you visited, or was it all? Is anything about topography that makes you confident what you knew firsthand?
I'm sorry, I would have to.
Is there anything in the style of his writing that indicates that he knew regions firsthand or would travel there?
Yes, I think it's quite a technical thing, but Baladhuri introduces his material, as classical Arabic historians do, by saying so-and-so told me, and so-and-so told me, and so on. And he uses, as other people do, a particular... If he says qala, he said, it almost certainly means he said in his book. I mean, because Arabic uses the same, he said in his book. But often, or sometimes, interestingly, he uses the term hadathani, I was told, and that seems to be that he had a direct oral communication, that somebody actually told him. And so he actually met these people. So we get hadathani narratives only from certain areas. Hadathani, obviously, he lived in Baghdad, Samarra, in the center of things. So we get a lot of hadathani narratives there. He moved in all the circles of people who were developing the science of traditions of Prophet Muhammad and so on. If I'm right, he traveled quite a lot in northern Syria. He traveled to Antioch, for example, which was in a Muslim town, and where there was obviously a sort of local history tradition growing up, because he gets Antiochene informants. He went to Damascus. I'm sure he went to Damascus because, firstly, his account of the conquest of Damascus shows a real understanding of the topography of the city. He knows where all the gates of the city are and so on. Whereas a lot of other places he doesn't, and that suggests me. But also he uses Damascene sources, obviously Syrian sources, which is kind of a bit weird at one level, because here is firmly Abbasid period historian using Syrian sources, which you'd imagine would be, full of Umayyad stuff and so on. But in fact, there's this old cliche that comes in Islamic history that the historians of the Abbasid period after 750 are wanting to rubbish the Umayyads and all constantly take a negative view of the Umayyads. Baladhuri doesn't at all. He clearly admires the Umayyad caliphs, like Muawiyah gets a very good press, Abdul Malik Hisham. He's got lots of time for the Umayyads at lots of different sort of levels. So yes, you could reconstruct him doing that. Whereas other areas, I think he didn't go to Eastern Iran, Khorasan and so on. There are no hadathani narratives from there at all. And that means I think he didn't go there. But I haven't sort of completely worked this out, and I'm not sure whether my argument really works, but I think you could do a little talab al-ilm, if you like, travelling in the search of knowledge of Baladhuri's, where he went and where he picked up first-hand narratives. I don't know that answers your question. Yes. So you have to speak up a little bit. I'm a little bit down.
You referenced how he was perceived essentially by his contemporaries and perhaps those who came after him. But amongst our historians now, how are his works perceived?
I think he's one of the great masters. I mean, he's definitely, he writes in a sort of style of classical Arabic, which is definitely classical. I mean, it's not like modern standard Arabic. It is a bit like sort of, I suppose, not that I'm a great Latinist, but the way Tacitus or somebody like that writes is very compressed prose, which actually, when you get the hang of it, is really rather intriguing and beautiful. But it is definitely Fusha, definitely classical Arabic. And I think that's, but also because the whole title of the book for lots of Muslims is very encouraging, if you like, the story of the Muslim conquests and so on, even if it's not actually about that very much. So he actually wrote, and this is a much longer book, called the Ansab al-Ashraf, the genealogies of the nobles, which is in fact enormous historical work. It's about 4 or 5 times as long as the Futuh al-Buldan. And it's now being published in a critical edition all the way through, but almost nobody's done any work on it at all. It's so massive and huge, and you just look at it and you think, yeah, okay, another 3 lifetimes I could have a go at this, but it's just the sheer amount of erudition. And I think he wrote that after the Futuh. I think he was exiled from court because of, or rather, there was no call for his services in court anymore. And I think it's a retirement project. the outside world. But nobody's even worked that out. I mean, there's so much of this early Islamic history that nobody's looked at all. I'm constantly, I mean, when I mingle, I go to seminars and so on with European historians who are writing the same sort of period, they're writing about the Carolingians or the Anglo-Saxons or whatever they are. And all these historians trying to find just a little bit, a little corner of the subject that they can make their own and so on. Well, when you come to Islamic history in this period, there are miles and miles of open spaces. I mean, it's such a land of opportunity.
There's your next book.
Sorry?
There's your next book.
That's too yeah. I have lots of ideas for next books, whether I'll get around to them or not, I don't know. Yes.
When living in Dubai, we visited Fujairah and going up to the north towards the border with Oman on the mountains.
Yes.
And we were frequently told that that was the site of the last battle that the Muslims fought to take the whole of the Arabian.
All right, that's interesting, yes.
I don't know who they were fighting against or whether in fact it was a true story. When one was there, it was a very level landscape.
Yes.
And many, what they said were headstones.
Oh, right.
Which the Arabs would leave. I wonder if you happen to know anything about that.
No, I don't. The historical geography of the Gulf Coast is very difficult to reconstruct because even quite big towns and so on, we don't know exactly where they were. Whereas in the Hijaz, things are much more, we know that Taif was there because it's still there today. Whereas the towns that are mentioned in the Gulf Coast and up towards Oman are lost. And we really, it's very difficult to reconstruct the historical geography. But that's interesting, and it's interesting that sort of, if you like, folk memory or memory survives. Yeah.
Yes, it's just something we were always told when we were...
Yeah, no, it's interesting, I haven't heard that before.
It's close to the Buldan, where...
Yes.
So right up in the extreme.
Yes, I find that. The Buldan isn't mentioned in Baladhuri at all. In fact, it's not mentioned in any early Arabic sources, I don't think.
Beautiful place, yeah.
I've seen the pictures.
Thank you.
We can guess from what you've told us, with his interest in the Zoroastrian community and his vaguely sort of Shiite leanings about inheritance from the Prophet. But how much do we know of his ethnicity?
His ethnicity is obscure. He's said to have been of Persian descent. We know that his grandfather worked in the Umayyad bureaucracy in Egypt. Right. So there must have been quite early converts and so on. I don't think he's necessarily a Shiite. I mean, I think that it's not really until the 10th century, it's very interesting, that you have to be either a Sunni or a Shi'i. Before then, respecting the family of the Prophet is not the same as being a Shiite. Being a Shiite involves believing that the family of the Prophet should rule the Muslim community by violence if necessary. That makes you a Shiite. But simply respecting the family of the Prophet, their genealogy and so on, doesn't make you a Shiite. It's in the 10th century with the coming of the Fatimids and the Bughyahids and so on that Shi'ism and Sunnism make a decisive split. Before then, I think people often get confused about it and say they must be a Shiite because they like Ali and things like that. It's not the case. That's what I think, anyway.
Yes. Did he actually talk about any tribes in Yemen, particularly the Hamdan?
Yes.
Is that featured at all?
No, it's... I wish you said more about this, because the tribes in the Yemen are very interesting because of the huge, long continuity. I mean, Khawlan were there in the early Islamic period, and Khawlan still live, as far as we can tell, in the same villages and towns that they lived in at the time of Prophet Muhammad,
yes.
Which is astonishing continuity,
yes.
Because obviously tribal names in the Syrian desert and the food and so on have changed completely through the centuries. So there's this huge conservatism Now, I wish he said more of that, but frustrating he doesn't, just for the odd silly stories. I don't think, he'd never been there. I don't think he was not really terribly interested. Like Al-Andalus. I mean, he talks about the Muslims conquer Spain and so on, but he hasn't got a clue. And what's more, he's not really interested either. Right.
Well, thank you very much. There's some refreshments here if anyone would like some. We'll ask questions if you ask.
Yes.
But thank you very much. Fascinating. I mean,
Good.
Yes. I look forward to getting your book. Next published, I think.
It's being published in early December, I think, or late November.
Yeah.
It's a bit odd to have physical copies of it and it not being published, but Allahu Alam. Who knows? Who knows?
But fascinating. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming.